Decisions made by the government have left 3.5 years on from the Grenfell tragedy, in which 72 people lost their lives, thousands of people trapped in unsafe homes, and many more unable to move. The announcement from the government has come far too late for many and is sadly a repeat of undelivered promises and backtracks on a key one. The key one being that no leaseholders should have to pay the cost of this scandal, which is not of their making. It was on the 11th of March 2020, nearly a year ago, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer said, all unsafe combustible cladding will be removed from every private and social residential building above 18 metres high. But that, my lords, has not happened. The fund set up has been dogged with problems. It would be helpful if the noble lord could tell the House how much of the money available has so far been spent. I believe there's been a major underestimation of this scandal, this problem by the government. Can the noble lord tell the House how many buildings are unsafe, where they are, and what danger they pose? Until the government have credible answers to these basic questions, there will continue to be mistakes, offering piecemeal solutions that must be updated when they do not deliver. Can the noble Lord Greenhalgh update the House and guarantee that the funding provided will cover all buildings over 18 metres high? Will the government set up an independent task force to prioritise buildings according to risk, with powers to get the funds out the door and the ability to go after building owners when they failed to get the work done? That's been a consistent problem we've been raising again and again. Ministers have now promised 17 times, yes, my lords, 17 times, that leaseholders will not bear the cost of fixing a problem they did not cause. Promises made to the innocent victims of this scandal. But the government have betrayed their promise that leaseholders would not pay for the building safety crisis. 3.5 years on from the Grenfell Tower disaster, hundreds of thousands of people cannot sleep at night because their homes are unsafe. On top of that, the government have decided to pile financial misery on them. This is wrong, this is an injustice, this is unacceptable. Can the noble lord tell the House why does this arbitrary 18-metre height limit mean that the difference between a safe home and potentially financial ruin? What are the terms of the loan? What will the interest be? Will leaseholders be required to pay the interest as well as the main costs? On the point the leaseholder will not pay any more than £50 a month, does that then, if they sell the property, does that have to be, the loan have to be paid at that point? Does it go with the former owner? Does it stay with the current owner? We need to know where we stand. And how long does this scheme run for? Will it go up by inflation each year? What will the government do if these homes remain unsaleable? How will they ensure that freeholders take up the loans? How will the government speed up remediation because the current stalemate cannot continue? Other properties do not have dangerous cladding, but these people have been charged thousands of pounds per flat to fix other safety issues. The government should focus on securing our economy and rebuilding from COVID, not saddling homeowners with further debt. The government should pursue those responsible to pay and prevent leaseholders and taxpayers from carrying the can. The government have announced a levy and a tax, which I welcome, but those responsible should bear the cost. But how much do the government anticipate the levy will raise? Will they pursue others, such as the cladding manufacturers, who are responsible for putting the dangerous cladding in the first place? The government have missed every target for removing ASM cladding, and 50,000 people are still living in flats wrapped in it. This is the same cladding that was found on Grenfell Tower, and thousands more have other dangerous cladding on their buildings. When will this all be removed? What about the skyrocketing insurance costs that innocent victims have been forced to pay? Could the noble Lord Greenhalgh tell the House what on average does he expect an average leaseholder to be paying? People cannot continue to live in unsafe, unsellable homes. Homeowners should not be faced financial ruin, even bankruptcy, to fix a problem they did not cause. Unfortunately, these proposals will still leave too many people struggling and facing loans instead of being given justice. This is a very poor statement from the government. They will have to come back to the table and do what they promised in the first place, that no victim of the scandal will have to bear the cost to fix a problem they were not responsible for.
Call the next speaker, Baroness Pinnock.
I thank the noble Lord the Minister for the repeat of this important statement on the government's response to the cladding crisis. I remind the House of my interest recorded in the register as a member of Kirklees Council and a Vice President of the Local Government Association. I was pleased when I read the heading of the statement, Building Safety, and the opening paragraph that refers to the mission of the Secretary of State being that of, and I quote, safety and fairness. Unfortunately, the statement then fails to live up to those laudable words. The first issue I have with the statement is that throughout there is only a reference to unsafe cladding. In fact, what has become clear as the vast scale of the problem that the Grenfell tragedy exposed is that the building safety failings go far beyond unsafe cladding. As flammable cladding is removed, in some buildings, further significant construction failings are revealed. Flammable insulation has been used. Fire breaks have not been built into the structure as a way of slowing the spread of a fire. Balconies that are not made of fire retardant material and spandrel panels are also seen as a potential safety concern. How do I know this? In January 2020, the department issued Guidance Note 23 relating to the 7 building components under review and requiring building owners and managers to take urgent action on these. The question for the Minister is, therefore, will the additional government funding pay for all the defects revealed when the unsafe cladding is removed? If, for instance, it becomes evident that there is an absence of fire breaks, will the funding cover the costs of installing them? If this is not the case, then the leaseholders will still be faced with large bills to pay for failings in construction. The next fundamental question that I hope the Minister is able to answer is why has 18 metres been chosen as the bar, above which cladding removal is funded by the government, and below that the leaseholders and tenants are required to pay? Is the 18-metre figure an historic one that needs to be reassessed? Serious fires can occur in blocks of varying heights. For instance, the fire in a block called The Cube in Bolton was very serious, fortunately without loss of life, but it is one that is lower than 18 metres. That leads me to the question of fairness, which is, as we recall, the mission of the department in building safety. Can the Minister explain how it is fair for leaseholders to have to pay for remediation in blocks below 18 metres? I recognise that low interest loans are available and that the maximum currently anticipated is £50 per month. This, however, will be added, no doubt, to the service charge, and that is one of the costs that potential buyers consider. It will make those flats less attractive to buyers and therefore almost certainly commanding a lower value. How is this fair to require leaseholders to pay for building remediation which is not in any way of their making? One of the roles of government is to ensure safety regulations are appropriate to the task and within an inspection regime that ensures it. This has been a government failing, and to my mind, the government has therefore some of the culpability and thus has to bear the costs and recoup those from those who share culpability. Then there is the question about building regulations. It is alleged that some of the buildings affected in this scandal failed to comply with building regulations at the time of construction. Can the Noble Lord the Minister confirm this and provide some estimates of the numbers involved? Where breaches of regulation are involved, will the government require full remediation costs to be met by the developer? This is what happens in cases of manufacturers of cars and white goods, for example. It should also surely apply in these instances. Does the Minister agree? Next is the question of the total funding package. The additional funding provided by the government is a start. 5 billion, though, needs to be put into context. During the debate on the Fire Safety Bill, the Minister confirmed that the total cost of remediation was likely to be in the region of £16 billion. Does that imply, therefore, that £10 billion or more will be paid for by leaseholders through the loan scheme? Is that the government calculation? Perhaps the Minister will let us know. The proposal for recouping from developers some of these costs is for £200 million to be raised per annum via a tax on the sector. Recouping the costs of the minority of the remediation from developers is, I have to say, pathetically small. The 5 largest developers made profits of around £16 billion over the last 4 years, which rather puts that into context. Will the government reconsider the level of this tax to make it fairer? Finally, I hope the government doesn't need to be reminded of the terrible personal cost of the cladding scandal. For instance, the plight of Laurel and Jonathan in Manchester, who are seriously considering bankruptcy as the only way out of their predicament. Of Hayley in Leeds, who has already been forced into bankruptcy. Of the 23% in an Inside Housing survey last year who had considered suicide. Such is the stress of living in an unsafe home and being forced to pay huge increases in insurance and service charges. For leaseholders and tenants, this building safety crisis is not in any way of their making, and yet they are being expected to pay the price, while those who created it are in any significant way not being similarly expected to pay. Can the Minister explain how that is adhering to the Department's mission of fairness? And will he press for a review of the current proposals as more information comes to light?
Minister. Lord Greenhalgh.
My Lords, this is a significant amount of money that's been committed, around £3.5 billion in direct additional grant, and that dwarfs the previous commitments of £1.6 billion. So that's over £5 billion committed to support the ending of the cladding crisis. And the plans go a long way to ensure that that affordability is not an issue for any of the leaseholders and medium risers, and it also ensures that where there is no warranty outstanding or insurance available that would protect leaseholders, that the taxpayer through the government's additional grant will step up and provide the funding necessary to ensure that the cladding system is removed. There's been a lot of questions from the Noble Lord Kennedy about progress. I'd point out that we saw more than 50% of starts take place in 2020, despite COVID, than in any other year. And then by the end of the year, 95% of all buildings with exactly the same sort of cladding as Grenfell, all those high-rises, had either started or completed remediation, so workers were on site. And we know exactly where those buildings are, and it's fair to say that the vast majority of the cladding will have been removed on all those buildings that remain to have the cladding removed by the end of the calendar year. The main thrust of the questions were around the scope of the fund, and it's very important to recognise that height does play a huge factor when it comes to life safety risk. the buildings, I mean, the higher the building, the more risk there is to the residents. For those people in buildings over 18 metres, between 18 metres and 30 metres, they are 4 times more likely to have a fire involving a fatality or the threat of someone requiring hospital treatment. In buildings over 30 metres, that rises to 35 times more likely. So we know that height is a clear factor. It's always been recognised that around 18 metres, that 18 metres is the cut-off point for the definition of a high-rise. That's been part of building regulations for a considerable number of years. But it's also fair to say that the definition that we're using for scope is above 6 stories. So indeed, the cube would fall within the remit of a building that could apply to the Building Safety Fund to remove its cladding. It doesn't. So that the threshold is 6 stories or more, or 18 metres, or greater than 18 metres. Now, there's no doubt that the long-term safety advice also makes clear that it's the external cladding system that acts as an accelerant. It helps the spread of fire, and that's why the government money is being focused on the removal of external cladding systems, whereas internal compartmentation, the fire breaks, the fire stopping, the fire doors, they are there designed to stop the spread of fire. So it is right that the taxpayers' money should focus on the material that accelerates the spread of fire. I would point out that this 3.5 billion is going to help hundreds, and also the finance scheme together, will help hundreds of thousands of leaseholders ensure that they don't bear significant cost in the case of those in medium rise and no cost in the case of high rise. So we know that 13,000 leaseholders in ACM buildings have been supported by the government grant scheme to date, and that between 70 to 90,000 leaseholders will be supported by those in buildings involving non-ACM cladding systems. So therefore, they will not bear any cost. And then the further 150,000 leaseholders will be helped in buildings between 11 and 18 metres. It is important that, however, that building owners do step up to the plate and support leaseholders, to support the remediation where the government grant is not able to support them, and we don't expect that to fall entirely on leaseholders. We expect the building owners to do the right thing, and we saw that with the ACM fund, where over 50% of building owners did do the right thing and ensure that the money didn't fall on leaseholders, and we expect to see that in the non-ACM buildings as well. So it's then that's often where warranty schemes are still able to be drawn on and do protect leaseholders. I'd point out that I think it is worth looking at the cladding manufacturers, and I'll take that point away because they are, as well as the developers, they are culpable of the situation we find ourselves in, and that's something that has been raised by both the Noble Lord Kennedy and the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock, and that's something that we can look at in due course. But I would point out that this is a 5-point plan that is looking at significant sums of money to support the removal of the external cladding systems, and it's those cladding systems that have accelerated the spread of fire and make it now far more unlikely that Grenfell will ever happen again. And we know that the future building safety regime will be focused on ensuring that the new buildings will be of far greater quality, and then provide the confidence that's required in the housing market to ensure that that begins to function properly in future years.
We now come to 20 minutes allocated for backbench questions. Questions and answers must be brief. Lord Young of Cookham.
My Lords, in welcoming the extra support for leaseholders, may I commend my noble friend for the role which I know he personally played in shifting the government's position. On the developer levy, which I called for last year, can my noble friend explain why this is going to be levied on future developments, which, as he's just explained, won't have the same problems, and where, indeed, the developers may be new to the market, rather than on those developers who are responsible for the defects and who did very well on the proceeds.
Well, I thank my noble friend for recognising that this is, the announcement does include a developer levy, which he was lobbying for, and that will be on future buildings. But at the same time, we recognise the role that a number of developers have played in creating the cladding crisis, and that is why the Secretary of State also announced that a new tax would be introduced for UK residential property development sector that will ensure that largest property developers also make a fair contribution in the remediation programme. And taken together, we think these measures will help to ensure that the industry does more to contribute to the remediation of historical cladding defects and play their part in dealing with this crisis.
Next speaker is Baroness Finlay of Llandaff.
To make the industry pay for its faults in the past, and that's a quote, how will the government recoup the full costs from those resistant to undertake remedial work before they close their companies? And are those who deliberately concealed evidence of flammability of ACM panels to be subject to corporate manslaughter investigations?
Well, my Lords, we will continue to push very hard to ensure that the developers make their contribution. And as I pointed out, historically we've seen developers and building owners step forward and pay for the remediation and removal of unsafe cladding that's on their buildings, and we'll continue to push developers to do the right thing. But this levy and this new tax is set to raise significant sums of money. The tax in itself is estimated to raise £2 billion over 10 years.
Next speaker is the Bishop of Newcastle.
My Lords, many leaseholders in high and medium-rise buildings are currently receiving insurance premium quotes for many, many times the previous annual cost. Much of the additional premium is not directly a consequence of cladding, but of wider concerns regarding fire risk in their building. And so removing and replacing deficient cladding will not in itself return premiums to a level of normality. Can the noble Lord the Minister tell us of any plans to meet with representatives of leaseholders and the insurance industry in order to agree a joint approach to alleviating this unacceptable burden?
My Lords, I can say that we are meeting with representatives of the insurance industry and representatives of the cladding groups to work on precisely that, on a solution to ensure that there is a common sense and proportionate approach to building insurance. And I would underline that it is increasing the pace of remediation that is likely to see a return to more sensible policies with regard to the setting of building insurance.
Baroness Warwick of Undercliff.
My Lords, I declare an interest as Chair of the National Housing Federation. Can the Minister explain why this very welcome new funding won't be made available to remediate the homes of people living in social housing? Housing associations don't have profits to draw on, and local councils can't simply deplete their reserves. So to make homes safe, they'll have to divert rental income that would have been spent on the upkeep of tenants' homes, investment in their communities, or building much needed new affordable homes. Does the Minister accept that the only way to resolve this problem once and for all is for the government to provide upfront funding for remediation of homes of all tenures, that then claw back as much money as possible from those responsible for creating these inadequate buildings in the first place?
My Lords, I point out that the priority of this government is to protect leaseholders from facing the costs for the removal of unsafe cladding, whether they're in social sector buildings or in private buildings, and that where registered social landlords feel that they need to impose costs on leaseholders, then there is access to grant funding available as well as the new financing scheme. So that is protecting the leaseholders in those properties, and that is the priority of this government.
Next speaker is Lord Shipley.
My Lords, I remind the House that I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. My Lords, those in a flat 19 metres high will have unsafe cladding replaced at no cost, and that is welcome. Those in a flat 17 metres high will have to pay up to £50 a month for an unknown period. My Lords, why does the government think that is fair?
My Lords, I pointed out that height is a marker for risk, and that those buildings greater than 18 metres are 4 times more likely to result in a fire-related fatality or the need to go into hospital for treatment. And that rises above 30 metres to 35 times more likely. So the focus needs to be on removing the material that accelerates the spread of fire in buildings that in and of themselves through height and being of residential use are at greater risk of causing fatalities.
Next speaker, Lord Best.
Lords, following the question from the noble Baroness, Lady Warwick, I understand that housing associations can apply for support from the extra 3.5 billion of additional funding for rectification of these appalling building defects in high-rise blocks, but that help will only be available for flats sold to leaseholders. For defects in housing association flats that are retained for letting, all the costs will fall on the housing association itself, requiring the diversion of funds intended for other purposes, particularly building new homes. Can the noble Lord the Minister give an estimate of how many new, desperately needed social rented homes will be lost because of this?
My Lords, I'm not in a position to give an estimate of that kind, but I would recognise that, that the social landlords do have significant resources that they can put into making sure they're building safe, and many are proceeding to do precisely that. You know, I do not think that we can easily estimate the impact on new build. But what we can say is that the funds do support those leaseholders that would face costs without access to grant funding or the financing scheme.
Lord Lancaster of Kimbolton.
The government has secured a welcome agreement on EWS1 forms that will benefit thousands of homeowners. Many other homeowners, however, still need to secure such a form before they can move on with their lives. So can my noble friend outline what steps the government is taking to making securing one of those forms easier?
My Lords, we're taking, thank my noble friend for raising this. This is a significant issue. We are looking at how we can increase the supply of the professionals needed to carry out those EWS1 assessments. And we have provided £700,000 worth of funding to the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and that is looking to upskill around 2,000 building surveyors to be in a position to do that after about a month's training. And as well as increasing the supply, we are working closely with RICS and other parties to narrow the scope of when EWS1 is required. You should not need to have an assessment of an external wall system in buildings under 11 metres. There's less latitude in buildings above 80 metres, and a number of buildings between 11 and 18 metres will also not require an EWS1. It's only in the event that they are covered with some kind of external cladding system to a great degree, so let's say more than 25%.
Next speaker, Lord Campbell-Savers.
Why doesn't the government require every local authority to publish addresses of all buildings falling under cladding fire risk categories? And is the FOI response from DCLG of the 12th of March last year refusing such information still valid, where it spuriously states, and I quote, disclosing it would likely endanger the safety of individuals, would enable someone to identify particular buildings usable by those with malicious intent. That could apply to any inflammable building, a chalet, indeed any temporary building.
My Lords, I do think it is sensible to be very careful about the dissemination of information about the location, precise locations of buildings with flammable material. And we do need to recognise there are people potentially out there with malicious intent, and it is quite right and proper that we keep the information that would enable people to identify those buildings confidential as far as possible.
Next speaker, Lord McNally.
My Lords, much of the effectiveness of this legislation will depend on the power and vigour of the building safety regulator. Will that be a named individual or a committee? And if it's a named individual, will he or she have the same powers as an ombudsman and receive complaints from individuals and community groups who have often complained and warned, but never had an access to a decision maker?
My Lords, I share the Noble Lord's scepticism about the value of committeeism, but I'd be pleased to announce that the leader of the new building safety regulator, the Chief Inspector of Buildings, has been announced, and I'm delighted that Peter Baker, who was the acting Chief Inspector, has been confirmed as the person that will be taking up the reins and ensuring that this new regime works, and he'll be accountable to ensure that it happens.
Baroness Altman.
My Lords, I welcome the Gateway 2 developer levy and the new tax on residential building developers. Could I echo calls for my noble friend to look carefully at recouping costs of remediation work from developers of past projects, not just those in the future, especially those who failed to comply with building regulations or cut corners at the time of construction, and also the manufacturers of the cladding materials, including ACN.
Well, I thank my noble friend for making the point, and it would be fair to say that the new tax on developers, and details will be announced shortly, will include a number of the major developers that are responsible for the high-rises historically. I think you make an important point that we should also consider the role of cladding manufacturers in this cladding crisis. It's fair to say that whilst developers have made good, solid profits in recent years, but the cladding manufacturers have had healthy profit margins too, and it is important that they are made to make a contribution to the resolution of the cladding crisis.
Baroness Young of Old Scone.
The Minister didn't answer the question raised by the Noble Baroness Lady Pinnock, where surveys post-Grenfell have revealed other fire-related defects like flawed fire separation. The leaseholders in these properties suffer the same problem of inability to sell, high remediation costs and rocketing or no insurance. Yet the government appears to be leaving it to leaseholders or building owners or somebody unspecified to pursue action against those who made the errors and omissions in the past. This isn't good enough. What will the government do to help these non-cladding victims?
My Lords, I did refer to the fact that the other building safety issues beyond the external cladding system, they are brakes on whether a fire continues to spread. They're not accelerants, and that the scope of our intervention is designed to deal with the biggest contributor to life safety risk, and that we would look to building owners to step up and help with the remediation of faulty building works where possible. And we have focused the additional grant funding on precisely that which is going to protect and save lives.
Lord Taylor of Gosmore.
My Lords, it's certainly welcome that the government has taken action on properties over 18 metres, but the great majority of tenants are in properties under that. And I would like, and I should refer to my declaration of interests, but I'm primarily a former chair of the National Housing Federation representing affordable housing providers. They've got huge numbers of tenants who've bought in shared ownership properties who are not well off, who currently are in enormous difficulties because despite what has been said by government and RICS about EWS1 inspections and the flexibility around them, in practice, lenders are continuing to insist on EWS1 inspections, and they are getting valuations at £0, serious delays and uncertainty for these not well off homeowners, and inspections everywhere. So will the Minister speak to the lenders about resolving this issue? And would he also accept that for those in shared ownership, a bill of £50 a month is unaffordable, given that the reason they're in these properties in the first place is that they are not otherwise able to afford a home?
My Lords, I'd point out that we have spoken to lenders, and in the announcements there were positive statements by both Barclays and the Chief Executive of Nationwide welcoming this and recognising that the additional £3.5 billion does help to provide certainty, admittedly in high-rises. And I'd point out that the financing scheme remains open to, to all, both social sector and private sector leaseholders, to ensure that they wouldn't have to pay more than £50 a month towards the remediation of unsafe cladding. So in the round, it is the announcement that we made that will hopefully give confidence to the market to be more sensible on valuation